Macarda, Fáilte Ash, and welcome to Undercover Irish. It's Misha Olin, your host, and together we are uncovering Ireland's hidden curriculum. And recently, Acarda put up 2 podcast episodes which tried to do just that, but did them through the lens or looking through the idea of sporting organisations, community organisations based around sport, both at home and abroad. First of all, there was GAA club names explained, mythology, rebels, and Irish identity. And in that podcast, what I tried to do was look at some of the lesser known GAA names. We acknowledge that the vast majority of clubs that play hurling and football in Common Lucas Gael tend to be named by either or after saints or patriots or simply the place of the club, the place name. What we looked at in that episode were maybe some of the lesser known ones. So we looked at the rapparees, we looked at the mythology, the many clubs that have mythological names tied to myth and legend in Ireland's history. And we went from national to international because we followed the trajectory of clubs which spread across overseas as well. We looked at how these names are a cultural identity, their language and their storytelling as well. And in the second podcast, the Corja, we looked at how the phenomenon of the Great Hunger and Gorta Moor brought an Irish sporting identity abroad as the many, many thousands of people fled Ireland in terms of forced economic migration and in terms of starvation, that they carried with them not just their own sense of identity, their own language, their own traditions, but in the new places that they put down roots, they formed sporting clubs and cultural organisations which often took the names inspired from home. And it wasn't just, as we saw, the Common Lucas Gael, the GAA. While we followed the trajectory of teams or immigrant teams like Exiles, Dear Vahacha or Erin in Liverpool, we followed how it went into other codes as well, like association football as they call it, soccer, how that game in Liverpool and in other places saw the multiplication of teams taking Irish names around about the late 1800s. And of course, we followed up into Scotland where we looked at the likes of Dundee Harp, Dundee Hibernian in Edinburgh, and of course, the famous Glasgow Celtic. And just a word on Celtic, I spent a short time in that episode on Celtic, and one of the comments on YouTube, of course, maybe highlighted that fact that that club obviously is probably the biggest diaspora club in the world in terms of global fame, in terms of support, and of course I agree with that comment. I spent a short time on that because it's my intention to return to Celtic in future podcasts to look at the social history and what it means for the Irish, not just in Glasgow, not just in Scotland, but overseas and around the world. Now, Corja, enough today. We continue that story. We continue the story of those 2 podcast episodes. If you haven't heard them, jump back and take a listen so that you can hear this one kind of in sequence. But at the heart of both of those podcasts and at the heart of the podcast today, what we want to look at is how identity is expressed and sometimes built through names, and how identity is forced to leave Ireland at times, but that identity goes with the people as they go overseas. In this podcast episode, we want to see what happens next. Those names, they didn't stay here, they travelled to London, to Boston, to Buenos Aires, to Montreal. Wherever Irish people went, they rebuilt identity again through clubs, through sport, through naming. Because, Corja, when you feel like everything else is lost, names are the one thing that you hold on to. And once you start seeing the following names, you realise something. They don't just tell Irish history, they tell a global story. Corja, you're listening to Undercover Irish. It's Misha Olin. I'm your host. And on this podcast, we try to uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. Wherever you are in the world, Accordia, at home or part of the great Irish diaspora abroad, Sigi Shear, sit back, enjoy Accordia, Erigling. Accordia, my friends, one of the things that prompted me to start writing these podcasts, these particular mini-series podcasts, if you like, around the names of sporting organisations, was the topic of unusual GAA club names. So like I said previously, many of them are very common and well known, the Patriots, the Saints and the place names. But there are a number of them that are a little bit more unusual. So on this podcast, before we go overseas, let's start off with a couple more of those unusual GAA names. Because in Ireland, GAA club names tend to do one of the following things. They preserve history, they claim legitimacy, they reflect community, or they reconnect with language and place and patriots, and sometimes they do all four at once. So, Accordia, in this episode, we're going to start off with the Four Masters Club in Donegal. Up in Donegal, a club called the Four Masters Club. The club itself was officially founded in 1932, but its roots go back further than that, to earlier teams in the area around 1905. It's the name that I'm interested in for the purpose of this episode. Four Masters. Now, if you had no understanding of Irish history, you might think this is something to do with mastery of the game. But actually, the name comes from the Annals of the Four Masters. Now, the Annals of the Four Masters, what are these? It's a massive historical record compiled in the 1630s by Franciscan scholars, including Micheál Ó Cléirigh. And the key context here, they're writing the end of Gaelic Ireland. So think about the 1630s, around about this time. It's shortly before Cromwell arrives into Ireland. And basically, around that time is the death knell of the Irish Gaelic order. This is after the flight of the Earls, after the Tudor conquest. The old political order has collapsed. So the annals at the time, they weren't just recording history. In a sense, they were trying to save it. And naming a club after them, it's not just nostalgia, it's a statement. We decide what Irish history is. Now, I'm really struck by this name, not just because of how unusual it is, even in terms of GAA names, to have a club named after one of the annals, but it shows the importance with which the founders of that club placed on this particular account of history, this preservation of the old order in historical form. Because, Accordia, if we think about it, who controls history in a colonized society? This is a cultural preservation, and it's also kind of a resistance as well. Now, while that particular example honours a kind of an educational or a knowledge or a foundation of information in terms of the annals, sometimes the name of a club is much more forceful and forthright. Cashel King Cormac's. This is a modern club formed through an amalgamation. But the name reaches back to Cormac Mac Coirigh. Cormac Mac Coirigh, a 12th century king of Munster, who died in 1138. And he's associated with Cormac's Chapel on the rock of Cashel. Now, Accordia, there's few sites in Ireland that are as iconic as that particular site, the rock of Cashel. It's in Tipperary, Cúnda Tuberdorn, first of all. It is one of Ireland's most iconic history sites, often called St. Patrick's Rock. Originally, it was the seat of the kings of Munster, and according to tradition, St. Patrick converted King Angus to Christianity here in the 5th century. Now, it's associated with early Irish mythological and royal power. And it's got a round tower, Cormac's Chapel, a cathedral, and it's a symbol of the link between kingship and the church at the time in Ireland. It's a site of power, ceremony, and had been for centuries. And even today at Corja, it remains an incredibly iconic and powerful site to visit. So this particular GAA club, based in this area, honours a king, Cormac Mac, and is associated with an area that still today carries an incredible iconic stature in terms of the site of the Rock of Cashel. What an incredible combination the two of those are side by side. But if that particular club draws old, almost ancient orders or power to its name, the next is a very unusual one and more modern. If we think about soccer names, football names, not just in Ireland, but in England, Scotland, Wales, and around the world, it's often common for the club to take a second name like Wanderers, Rovers, Ramblers, City, Town, United. But in this case, this GAA club has a second name which is more in keeping with those particular naming structures. I'm talking about a club in Wexford, Faith Harriers. So Faith Harriers is a club founded in 1949. Very unusual in terms of GAA to have a name like that. Faith itself, not so much. This is a place or an area within Wexford town. But Harriers is certainly an unusual second name for the GAA club. And the story goes that while this club was built from scratch, even borrowing jerseys, organising locally, the name Harriers stood because of a favour to the people that they borrowed the equipment from to form the club in the very first place. And right through to today, it still carries that unusual and striking name, Faith Harriers. Now, if Faith Harriers represents something a little bit more modern, the next example I'm going to move to is a lovely one because it links an older order with a newer world. You've heard the phrase, the Normans becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. Well, that's exactly what I see when I see the name, the Geraldines GAA Club. The Geraldines GAA Club is a name that exists because of the Normans. It comes straight from their legacy and their lineage in Ireland. The club exists in Dublin. There are other ones as well. And the name comes from the Fitzgerald dynasty, Mac Gerald, the Mac Geralds, a Norman family who arrived in Ireland in the 12th century. And over time, they became part of Irish identity itself, became more Irish than the Irish themselves. And this is something that you can't display more clearer than having a name of a GAA club named after that dynasty, the Geraldines. Now, the Geraldines are noted and notable, that GAA club, for another reason. Because if we think back to the early years of the GAA and we look at the Roll of Honour and we see which counties won which All-Irelands in the early years, and I mentioned this in a previous podcast, sometimes those counties were actually represented by clubs. And way back in 1899, the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship final was held in Dublin, and it was fought out between Dublin and Cork, Dublin winning on a scoreline of 110 to 6 points. But what's notable about that particular final is that Dublin were represented by the Geraldines club. And it just shows you what a powerhouse that particular club was in the early years in Dublin in the Gaelic Athletic Association. So the Geraldines is something that comes from the Norman tradition in terms of its name, the Mac Geralds. It's something which represents that in club form. Tells us a little bit more, not just about modern history, but indeed Irish history, going right back to the Norman conquest. Now, Accordia, I didn't just mention that All-Ireland final for the sake of it. I was kind of moving towards the next transition. So, in a previous podcast episode, I used a Liverpool-based GAA club to transition abroad overseas into the diaspora and not just into the diaspora, but onto different sports. And I'm kind of doubling up here because there's a number of connections coming together. So if we transitioned across the sea in the last episode, or in the first episode, using Dear Vrahacha O Éireann, that club that was named Exiles in Liverpool, sometimes we forget that London once played in All-Ireland finals. London as a county played in All-Ireland finals. And this tells us just how popular the Gaelic games were in London. It also tells us how strong they were in London. Probably not a surprise when we look at the sheer amount of Irish immigrants that arrived in London around the time. But a club, similar to the Geraldines representing Dublin, a club once represented London in an All-Ireland final. And I find the name of the club very interesting because in a previous podcast episode, when we were talking about soccer clubs or football clubs with Irish names, one of those that featured prominently was Hibernian in Edinburgh. And we also mentioned Hibernian or Hibs in Dundee. This particular club, which represented London in an All-Ireland final, was known as Hibernian. And Hibernian club represented London in the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship in 1901. The game was actually played in 1902, and this was common enough when delays happened in early competitions. They were playing Kerry, and they were playing at Jones's Road. That was the old Croke Park. Kerry beat London on this occasion, but it does serve as an example for us to recognise, first of all, the strength of the GAA, not just in London, but overseas, given the sheer volume of Irish immigrants that arrived into places like London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Liverpool, and not just Britain, but around the world as well. America, for example, and we'll come to that in just a second. But it also serves as an example of Hibernian, which is normally associated with soccer or football, being used as a sporting club in the form of the GAA. And it also allows us to transition to England, to London, and to other sports again. Because if Hibernian Club was an example of the London Irish organising themselves along GAA lines, well, right through to this day, there's a very obvious example of the London Irish organising themselves in community and club form, but this time in rugby. Of course, the club is called London Irish, an extremely powerful statement, a very obvious statement, a very clear statement. But London Irish, true to this day, is a representative of what was going on in that sphere of sport and community. So London Irish was founded in 1898, so close enough to the time we were talking about in terms of Hibernian representing London in an All-Ireland final. And it was established by Irish migrants in London. Originally it was amateur, later became a professional rugby union club. Now, if in a previous podcast episode we focused a little bit on the growth in Britain in terms of soccer clubs, football clubs, association football clubs, to give them their old name, and them as an expression of the Irish playing a different sport other than GAA, other than hurling and Gaelic football. Well, this is proof, I guess, or the example of the fact that there were Irishmen in London or in England who wanted to play a different code, rugby. Now, Corja, not only does London Irish bring us to a different game in terms of rugby, but it brings us to a more clearer way of expressing that Irish name. It's literally there, Irish. And when we think about other clubs, and we've mentioned them before, we think about Glasgow Celtic, which inspired not just other clubs in the area or in the region, but clubs worldwide to adopt the idea of Celtic. Now, this brings us across the Atlantic. Boston isn't just influenced by Irish identity, it was transformed by it. We're talking about the 1850s. Irish people made up over a third of the city's population. Imagine that. Tens of thousands had arrived in the space of a decade during Ungurta Moor, the Great Hunger. And they arrived into hardship, overcrowding, housing, discrimination, expulsion from jobs. Now, within a number of generations, that same community actually came to dominate the political life of the city. You're talking about mayors, you're talking about senators, and even a president of the United States in the case of John F. Kennedy, JFK, all emerged from that Boston Irish world. So when we talk about identity here, we're not talking about survival anymore. We're actually talking about power. And you can see that power reflected in something simple but global as a name, the Boston Celtics. So if London Irish were rugby, now we're talking about the bouncing ball, basketball. The Boston Celtics were founded in 1946, so just shortly after World War II. And they were named deliberately to reflect the Irish nation, or the Irish nature, I should say, of the population of the city. You know, they carried the colour green, the shamrock, the symbolism. And over time, they became one of the most successful sporting teams in basketball. So this isn't about the GAA or the Cumberland Class Gael being exported. This is something else entirely. This is Irish identity being absorbed into the mainstream, into global sport, into branding, into global culture. And the story doesn't stop on the court, because if we go back to Donegal, remember we were talking about the four masters, the scholars writing down Irish history at a moment, particularly when it became under threat, the annals. We see the same instinct appear in America, but this time institutional, at Notre Dame, founded in 1842, a Catholic university, a centre of Irish American life. And of course, they take on the nickname, the Fighting Irish. A name once thrown around as an insult, but now proclaimed as a kind of a pride, I suppose. And just like the Four Masters, the GAA club preserves identity through history and text, that kind of link to education, or that link to, I suppose, what is a history of Ireland. Notre Dame preserves it through education, through institutions, and through continuity. So whether it's 1/3 of a city in the 1850s, 17 championships in the NBA, or a university carrying identity across generations, the pattern is the same. Identity survives, not just being remembered, but by being named, claimed, and visible to the world. And maybe that's the thing, Akara. We started out on this journey, it might have seemed something simple, it might have seemed very straightforward, just names, just clubs, just sport. But the more you follow them, the more you realise that they're anything but simple, because in Ireland, those names were never just labels, they're acts of memory. The Four Masters, writing history at the moment it was in danger of slipping away. Cashel, tying a club to kingship, to land and to power. The Geraldines reminding us that identity in Ireland has always been layered and complex and kind of evolves over time as well. And then identity is forced to move across the Irish Sea, to London, to Glasgow, to Liverpool. And there are name changes slightly, but the instinct stays the same. Hibernian, Celtic, London Irish. They're not clubs, they're statements. They're saying we are still here, we still belong, and we still remember. And then across the Atlantic to Boston, where the identity doesn't just survive, it expands, it fills streets, it shapes politics, and it builds institutions. And it becomes so embedded that a basketball team can carry it. And just think for a second there, it is unusual for a basketball team in the NBA. In fact, I think it's unique to carry a name, a second name, which is linked to a civilization, an ethnicity, and a culture. The Celtics. And from there it moves into education, to Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish. And so what are we really looking at here? It's not just about sport, and it's not just about names. You're looking at a pattern. The people who, when everything else gets taken, they hold on to one thing, the name, the identity. Because the name carries the story. The name carries the place and the memory. And whether it's written in the annals back in the 1600s, whether it's a team playing in Croke Park or at a local field in GAA, whether it's the hoops around the green and white jersey in Glasgow, or whether it is basketball jersey in Boston, the meaning is the same. Identity doesn't survive by accident. It survives because it is named. And once it's named, it can't disappear. Corja, I've really enjoyed putting this one together. It kind of follows the previous two episodes, which focused on a similar topic, the names of sports clubs. I still have one or two more to go. I'm looking forward to going to Canada in particular, and perhaps, I should say, Australia and maybe even South America, all the while linking it back home, if you like. This week saw the 1 year anniversary of the podcast, if you like, the first birthday. And I can recall recording that episode and publishing it, but never sharing it. And I never shared it until I had a second episode up. And reflecting on that now, a year seems like a long way away, or a year seems like a long journey, I should say. But it's been an extremely enjoyable experience. And most of all, it's enjoyable because the listeners are there and listeners get back and give feedback. And I really thank you for those personal messages that I've received over the course of the year, whether I've accompanied you on your journey to work or while you're doing the housework or wherever you consume your podcast or whenever you consume your podcast. Gorv Mila Mahagut. Asok for 8 Lum. Thank you so much for joining me. And Corja, one small favour I'd asked if you've listened this far and if you've enjoyed it is to go and leave a review if possible, wherever you get your podcasts or wherever you are listening. Thank you so much for your continued support, especially Macorja. Thank you so much to patrons who support on Patreon. And if you want to search up Undercover Irish on Patreon, I'm over there if you'd like to support. Macorja, until the next episode, Gorv Mila Mahagut Osok Felum, as always, Berigi Bua, and Slonga Phone Macorja.